The cameras flash in a frenzy, their bursts bouncing off the gleaming gold pacifier held aloft like some twisted crown. FIFA officials hover around Donald Trump with smiles stretched too wide, as if they've rehearsed this moment in a room where no one dared laugh. Trump grips the pacifier like it's a trophy, won through sheer entitlement, nodding smugly while the world watches, stunned and confused. It feels like satire, but no comedian would dare push a joke this far. Half a world away, in a dim studio lit only by the glow of breaking news banners, Jon stares at his monitor. The headline crawls across the screen with the quiet menace of a storm cloud. Possible U.S. military action in Venezuela. For a split second, he forgets to breathe. His chest tightens, his pulse spikes, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he hears the old echoes: Baghdad, Fallujah, casualties, briefings, lies. The déjà vu is so sharp it feels surgical. He isn't just remembering history, he's reliving it. The same patterns, the same language, the same swagger from leaders, promising clean victories that never come. As Trump beams beside his gold pacifier, Jon feels the weight of every interview he ever conducted with soldiers who returned broken and officials who never admitted fault. The absurdity of the moment clashes violently with the seriousness unfolding on his screen, and he feels the world splitting into two realities. One, drunk on performance. The other, trembling with consequence. Jon's fingers hover above the keyboard as he tries to steady his breath. The spectacle on one side of the world feels like an insult to the trauma on the other. He feels the ghost of every unanswered question, every censored warning, rising from the past, like smoke from a battlefield that never stopped burning. The newsroom hum fades beneath the roar of memory, urging him to speak, to fight, to refuse silence. Something dangerous is unfolding, and he feels destiny tightening around him. Jon leans closer to the screen, his voice barely a whisper. Not again. Outside his studio window, the city moves on, oblivious. But inside, something shifts. A chill runs through him, the kind that warns you a story isn't just news, it's a warning. And as Trump lifts the pacifier higher, basking in applause that rings hollow, Jon senses a collision coming, a moment where spectacle and danger will tear into each other with no buffer. And little did anyone know, both stories were about to collide in a way no one saw coming. For a moment, the world laughs. Social media turns the gold pacifier into a punchline, a meme, a late-night monologue waiting to happen. But beneath the humor lies a darker question that very few dare to ask. Why would FIFA, a global sports empire already drowning in scandals, choose this moment to shower affection on a man who thrives on spectacle? Why this gesture, now, when the geopolitical ground is trembling under everyone's feet? It isn't just odd, it's strategic. FIFA knows how to survive storms, and sometimes survival means flattering the loudest voice in the room. A pacifier may look like a joke, but it's also a message. Soothe the ego, avoid the backlash, keep the money flowing. The absurdity stops being funny once you realize it's a calculated offering to power. Meanwhile, Venezuela sits at the edge of a familiar cliff. Reports leak, whispers spread, and analysts begin to connect dots that leaders insist are unrelated. The rhetoric grows harsher, the briefings more urgent, the explanations more rehearsed. The last time Jon heard this pattern, the world was preparing for a war that reshaped an entire generation. And now, as he scans the details flooding across his screen, every instinct inside him screams that history is slipping its leash again. America's memory, Jon knows too well, is tragically short. Leaders count on that. They rely on the public, forgetting the shaky evidence, the manipulated intelligence, the promises that dissolve the moment boots hit the ground. But Jon's memory is long, it's detailed, it's scarred. He remembers the families who begged for answers. He remembers the reporters who lost their careers for pushing too hard. He remembers the feeling of being drowned out by certainty. That later collapsed into regret. Why Venezuela? Because it's vulnerable. Because its crisis can be framed, spun, packaged for a public that has learned to digest conflict like entertainment. Because politicians who failed to learn from Iraq now see an opportunity to posture without admitting past mistakes. And the more Jon reads, the clearer it becomes. This isn't about democracy. It's about dominance, distraction, and the illusion of decisive leadership. It's about waving a pacifier in one hand while moving chess pieces with the other. The contradiction is almost unbearable. A global sports titan humors a politician for the sake of convenience, while a nation teeters on the verge of intervention disguised as salvation. One story is absurd, the other catastrophic, yet both expose the same truth. Power performs for applause while people pay the price. Jon feels the stakes rising like a tide around his ankles, cold and unstoppable. He feels the urgency tightening in his throat, reminding him that silence now would be complicity later. He scrolls through new reports pouring in, each more concerning than the last. Experts warn of escalation, allies urge caution, but the machinery of certainty spins faster every hour. Venezuela becomes the testo of memory, of conscience, of whether a country capable of such profound tragedy is capable of learning from it. Jon closes his eyes for a moment, steadying himself against the swell of dread. He knows the pattern, he knows the ending, but he also knows something has shifted this time, something fragile and dangerous, because what happens next doesn't just echo the past, it threatens to rewrite it. The story of the villain doesn't begin with one man or one institution. It begins with a machinery, huge, glittering, hungry, fed by ego, spectacle, and an almost religious refusal to admit past mistakes. Trump is simply one face of it, a loud and unforgettable emblem of a system that rewards performance over substance. His clashes with international organizations are legendary, not because they were shocking, but because they were predictable. He approached every global institution the way a showman approaches a stage, as something to dominate, to bend, to demand applause from. If they didn't cheer loudly enough, he mocked them. If they contradicted him, he dismissed them. If they recognized him, even symbolically, he treated it as proof that he alone was the axis around which the world turned. A golden pacifier was absurd, but to him, it fit neatly into a long history of trophies collected not for achievement, but for affirmation. And FIFA had its own script, one that didn't need any rewriting. The organization carried decades of accusations like a shadow that refused to detach. Bribery scandals, mysterious transactions, host country controversies, whispered deals behind closed doors. It had mastered the art of global optics, polishing its image even as the world squinted at the fingerprints smudging the glass. FIFA understood power because it was built on power. It knew how to flatter it, negotiate with it, survive it. That's why the gold pacifier wasn't just a joke. It was a strategy. A symbol of compliance disguised as celebration, a way of currying favor without uttering a single politically risky word. Better to hand a man a shiny object than risk the wrath of someone who treated criticism as betrayal. But the real antagonist, the one Jon feared, the one he recognized instantly, wasn't Trump or FIFA alone. It was the long, unbroken chain of American foreign policy decisions forged in the fires of arrogance and historical amnesia. A chain that stretched from Vietnam to Iraq, from interventions cloaked in noble language to realities drenched in chaos. It was the pattern of leaders insisting on strength while ignoring consequence, of officials selling certainty that later dissolved into confusion. It was the revolving door of justifications: protect democracy, restore order, defend allies, prevent collapse. Every reason sounded righteous until the bodies piled up and the truth surfaced years too late. The system thrived on short public memory, ephemeral outrage, and the hope that people would forget the fine print beneath the headlines. It relied on repetition, the same stakes, the same warnings, the same mistakes, dressed in fresh rhetoric. Jon knew that cycle intimately. He'd watched it consume administrations, journalists, families, entire regions. He'd seen how politicians hardened their positions not because they believed in them, but because to appear uncertain was to appear weak. Strength became performance. Victory became illusion. And diplomacy became a stage where every gesture, every grin, every symbolic gift served as a prop in a larger narrative. Trump's obsession with grand visuals, parades, gold tokens fit perfectly into this machinery. To him, symbols mattered more than systems, gestures more than governance. FIFA, addicted to global applause, played into that obsession effortlessly. And together, whether intentionally or not, they reminded Jon of a truth that unsettled him to his core. Institutions that should hold power accountable often end up orbiting it instead. The arrogance wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, hidden in the assumptions baked into policy memos and press conferences. The contradiction wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it was wrapped in patriotic language that disguised its fragility. But Jon could see it clearly. He'd spent years watching officials insist that lessons had been learned, reforms implemented, safeguards installed. Yet here the world stood again, on the brink of repeating history with the same overconfidence that had once plunged entire regions into chaos. The villain, in this story, is the system that confuses confidence with competence, optics with truth, and power with wisdom. A system that rewards those who shout the loudest, who demand loyalty, who trade integrity for spectacle. A system that hands out golden pacifiers while preparing military briefings in the next breath. Jon knew this machinery wasn't just dangerous, it was relentless. It didn't pause for reflection. It didn't slow for memory. It didn't bend for caution. As he watched Trump bask in the glow of a symbol, while whispers of intervention grew louder, Jon felt the machinery turning once more, not because it hadn't been warned, not because it hadn't been scarred, but because it had learned how to survive by forgetting. And somewhere deep in that turning, Jon sensed a storm gathering, one powered by pride, corruption, and the ancient, undefeated enemy of truth, the refusal to remember. Jon wasn't always the man with the steady voice and the haunted eyes. Years before the world knew him as a political analyst, he was a young reporter standing in cramped newsrooms during the Iraq buildup, watching officials smile as they threaded lies into the national bloodstream. He remembered the late nights when intelligence reports didn't match public statements, when questions were discouraged, when editors urged caution because patriotism sells, doubt doesn't. He remembered swallowing his frustration, convincing himself he didn't have enough proof to push harder. And in the quiet moments afterward, when broadcasts ended and the lights dimmed, he felt the weight of every truth he hadn't fought fiercely enough to expose. The regrets didn't come all at once. They came slowly, like a series of whispered accusations. Every time a soldier's mother asked why her son had died, every time he interviewed veterans who spoke with cracked voices and trembling hands, every time he looked at the footage of burning cities and wondered whether he, by being careful, had helped someone else be reckless. He carried that guilt the way others carried medals close to the heart, always visible to those who knew where to look. His personal life didn't escape the fallout either. Friends he'd grown up with enlisted, some returning, changed, others not returning at all. Family gatherings grew tense when politics surfaced, because Jon couldn't keep quiet anymore. His career soared, but he often felt like he was walking on the graves of his own hesitations, and so he made a promise. One he repeated like a vow carved into stone: never again. Never again would he let fear or caution dull his voice. Never again would he trade truth for comfort. Not on my watch, he said, again and again, until the words became his compass. So when the first reports of potential intervention in Venezuela appeared, the old sickness twisted in his stomach. The phrases sounded familiar, the tone suspiciously swift, the confidence unmistakably hollow. It felt like watching a ghost reenact a tragedy he had already lived through. And as he sat before the glowing screen, heart pounding with unwelcome recognition, Jon understood that this wasn't just another news cycle. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment he had promised he would never fail again. The volume of the national conversation rises like steam in a pressure chamber. Cable networks fill their panels with familiar faces insisting that intervention in Venezuela is not only justified, but overdue. They speak with polished certainty, repeating the same confident phrasing Jon remembers from 20 years ago, as if the old script had simply been dusted off and updated with new names. One pundit leans forward and declares that strategic dominance requires bold action, and moments later, Trump echoes the phrase on social media, boasting that America is finally showing strength again. The gold pacifier appears behind him in photos, displayed proudly on a shelf like a miniature monument to his ego. And commentators laugh, as if the absurdity proves his power rather than undermines it. FIFA, sensing the attention, doubles down. Spokespeople insist the gift was harmless, a gesture of international goodwill. But privately, everyone knows it was a shield, another attempt to stand close enough to power to avoid being burned. The spectacle becomes its own ecosystem: Trump preening, FIFA defending, pundits dramatizing, and an entire media class feeding on the frenzy while avoiding the uncomfortable truth beneath. Jon enters the arena reluctantly, but necessarily. At first, he's a lone voice on interviews, live streams, and panel discussions, urging caution while others roll their eyes. Some dismiss him gently, patronizingly, calling him too emotional from past experiences. Others attack more directly, accusing him of clinging to ancient history and undermining national unity. The conversations grow sharper. Jon confronts the talking points one by one, pointing out inconsistencies, highlighting familiar patterns, reminding viewers of costs they seem desperate to forget. But each time he speaks, the machinery pushes back harder, drowning him in volume rather than logic. He feels the old frustration stirring inside him, the same frustration that silenced him in 2003. Only this time, he refuses to yield. The debates become personal. Pundits treat him not as a colleague but as an obstacle to their narrative. Trump mocks critics during a rally, bragging about his strategic instincts. FIFA officials dodge questions. And Jon, standing alone in the studio light, senses a tide gathering against him. Not because he's wrong, but because he's right, too early. The pressure builds with every segment, every confrontation, every moment when his warnings are waved away by people who fear hesitancy more than war. He feels a tipping point, forming an invisible line he knows he will soon be forced to cross. And as the debates intensify, Jon realizes the next time he speaks, it won't be to argue. it would be to break the cycle or be broken by it. The studio falls into an uncanny stillness, the kind that feels choreographed by fate. For once, no one interrupts. No one smirks. Even the host, normally eager to cut tension with a commercial break, instinctively leans back as if giving Jon the floor. Is the only logical choice? Cameras tighten on his face, catching the flicker of resolve in his eyes. The calm before a truth he's held for years finally demands air. Jon draws a breath, steady and deliberate. We've heard this story before. He begins, his voice low enough to pull everyone in. We've heard the promises of quick victories, the speeches about restoring order, the confident predictions that crumble the moment real lives are at stake. A few panelists shift in their seats, discomfort quickening across their expressions. He continues unfazed, each word landing with surgical precision. You can dress it up as strategy, call it dominance, sell it as rescue bow, it's the same script we used to justify disasters we still haven't recovered from. He pulls out a printed briefing, its highlighted sections glowing under the studio lights. This was circulated today, he says. Almost identical language to the memos we saw in 2002. Same omissions, same exaggerations, same convenient erasures. The host glances nervously at the producers. This wasn't supposed to get this real. And you, Jon adds, turning to a pundit who had bragged hours earlier about inside sources, have repeated talking points pulled from a document that hasn't even been verified. Silence floods the studio, heavy, electric, undeniable. Jon leans in. And while all of you debate the optics, while Trump poses with his shiny pacifier like a child rewarded for tantrums, we ignore what that symbol really represents. Institutions that flatter power instead of questioning it. Organizations that soothe ego while policy spirals into danger. A system that treats war like a rebranding opportunity. The panelists falter. One opens his mouth to respond but quickly closes it, realizing the foundation of his earlier argument has been dismantled brick by brick. Another looks down, hands clasped, as if praying for a commercial break to rescue him. The host clears her throat, trying to regain control of the moment. But Jon isn't finished. This isn't patriotism, he says softly. This is performance. And people die when performance wins. Reaction ripples through the mix of shock, grudging respect, and the dawning awareness that something irreversible has happened. The confidence of the opposing voices collapses under the weight of truth spoken without apology. Jon sits back, not triumphant, but resolute. Knowing he has crossed the line he long avoided. And across the country, millions lean closer to their screens, sensing that this was not just commentary, it was a reckoning. The internet doesn't just react, tip detonates. Within minutes of Jon's takedown airing, hashtags spread like wildfire, climbing from local chatter to global trend. Hashtag Jon said it, hashtag pacifier politics, and hashtag no more Iraq moments surge across platforms, each one carrying clips of his steady voice cutting through the noise. The gold pacifier becomes the symbol of the week, reshaped by the internet's imagination into something sharper, funnier, and far more dangerous for those who thought they could hide behind spectacle. Memes flood every corner, Trump cradling the pacifier like a royal heirloom, FIFA executives running from a nursery full of gold-plated toys, pundits photoshopped with baby bottles labeled talking points. Yet beneath the humor, something deeper stirs. Veterans, those who fought, those who watched friends fall. Those who know the cost of political arrogance better than anyone begin posting their own reflections. They share Jon's clip alongside messages that land with the weight of lived truth. Finally, someone said it. This is what we warned about. History doesn't have to repeat if people listen. Their voices give Jon's moment a gravity memes alone could never carry, transforming his words from commentary into testimony. Politicians feel the tremor immediately. Some rush to reframe their earlier statements, suddenly emphasizing caution and diplomacy, pretending they were never part of the accelerating drumbeat. Others go silent, hoping the storm passes without forcing them to defend positions built on shaky logic. For the first time in days, the narrative wobbles, no longer obedient to the polished scripts crafted behind closed doors. Jon's take has injected doubt into a conversation that depended on blind confidence to survive. Late night shows seize the moment with enthusiasm. Monologues open with oversized gold pacifiers rolling across the stage, hosts reenacting FIFA's ceremony. With dramatic flair, audiences roar as jokes land harder than expected, because everyone knows humor only bites this sharply when it's telling the truth. The symbolism becomes inescapable. Even those who ignored the political debate cannot escape the cultural shockwaves, rippling through their feeds. Somewhere in the noise, Jon sits quietly, watching the world react. He didn't expect this. He didn't plan for a viral moment or a cultural reset. But as the momentum builds, people remembering, questioning, refusing to swallow easy answers, he realizes something rare is happening. His words didn't just break through the machinery. They bent it, and the storm he sensed gathering has only just begun. The frenzy slowly settles, leaving a strangely quiet clarity in its wake. Jon sits in his studio long after the cameras stop rolling, replaying the reactions, the messages, the sudden shift in national tone. For the first time, in a long time, he feels the weight of the moment, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. When he finally speaks again, this time in a calmer segment, stripped of theatrics, his voice carries the tremor of someone who knows he's standing at the crossroads of memory and consequence. He looks into the camera as if speaking directly to every person who stayed silent during the last war, every person who regretted trusting the wrong words. There's something we need to understand, he says softly. Power loves symbols more than truth. It always has. The gold pacifier wasn't just ridiculous, it was revealing. Because when leaders cling to spectacle, it's usually to distract us from what they don't want us to see. He pauses, allowing the honesty to fill the space. History repeats itself when we stop questioning, when we nod along, when we convince ourselves that this time will be different just because we want it to be. But the world can't afford another Iroquois. Families can't survive another generation of regret. Countries can't rebuild from another mistake, sold as confidence. Jon's expression tightens, not with anger, but with conviction. And sometimes, it isn't the speeches or the reports or the press briefings that expose the truth. Sometimes, it's a Jokashani pacifier held up like a trophy that shows us the cracks in an empire. The absurdity makes us look closer. The humor makes us think. The symbol becomes the warning. He leans forward slightly, as if bridging the gap between the studio and every living room watching. This moment isn't about politics. It's about memory. About refusing to let the past fade just because it's inconvenient. About making sure those who paid the price for our mistakes didn't do it for nothing. There's a quiet intensity in his final words, a pulse of purpose that cuts through the screen. That's why we fight. Not for politics, but for memory. And so, we arrive at the crossroads where spectacle meets consequence, where a gold pacifier and the threat of another foreign intervention collide in the harsh light of reality. The title wasn't just a hook, it was the contrast playing out on the world stage. On one side, absurdity polished in gold. On the other, a familiar danger rising like a shadow the nation keeps pretending it doesn't see. Jon's voice, steady and unshaken, becomes the thread stitching these worlds together, reminding us that beneath every joke lies a truth we ignore at our peril. He looks into the camera one last time, carrying the weight of memory like a lantern. If you've watched this far, he says, you already know what's at stake. You've seen how symbols can distract us, how power hides behind theatrics while real people bear the cost. You've seen how easy it is for history to slip back into the grooves it carved decades ago. Jon's tone shifts, rising with a gentle urgency. But if you believe truth matters, if you believe questioning power is not only a right but a responsibility, then you're already part of something bigger than a headline. You're part of the memory that keeps this country honest. He leans back slightly, letting the words settle. And if you refuse to let history repeat it, you refuse to let another Iraq happen while the world is busy laughing at a gold pacifier, then stay with us. Stand with us. The screen tightens around him, the moment sharpening like a vow. Join this channel. Subscribe. Share. Be part of the voice that says, not again.